Shalini. I'm the curator for the India Art Fair talk series titled Growing Focus. We're generously supported by JSW. Growing Focus examines the increasing prominence of South Asia within contemporary art and culture. The series highlights the efforts of people of the global majority, comprising more than 80% of the world's population with roots in Indigenous, African, Asian, and Latin American cultures, who are asserting their presence across arts and cultural ecosystems. Amid the ongoing decentering of global north, quote-unquote, narratives, it frames this moment not merely as a response to decolonization, but as a landmark historic moment of self-determination. We explore this impact for audiences today and every day. All of our talks are conducted in Indian Sign Language. Can I have a round of applause for my colleagues? Some of our talks are also going to be translated live in Bengali, Tamil, and Hindi later today. This particular talk that you're here to attend spotlights how the rising prominence of the global majority and how does it impact our arts ecosystems. Dr. Njami, who's an independent curator, lecturer, art critic, and novelist. We have Sharmini Pereira, chief curator from the Museum of Modern Art and Contemporary Art in Sri Lanka. We have Sangeeta Thapa, founder and chairperson of the Kathmandu Triennale. We have Adajania, independent curator, cultural theorist, and art critic of India. They're trying to address what are the best ways of attempting inclusivity of multiple narratives in cultural institution building. This is moderated by Parmesh Shahani, who is the head of the Godrej DEI lab and an independent author as well. As more attempts are being made now to access, record, and learn more about these micro and macro histories, in this, when we look deeper at intersections of social difference, like caste, class, gender, age, sexuality, ethno-linguistics, and ableism, it raises the genuine question, how does one deem anything inclusive? As cultural leadership of institutions, as well as curators and writers of this changing ecosystem, we have here ways in which we're trying to understand what are the measures to ensure no gatekeeping or insularity occur in this process, and the toughest question, when will all of this ever be done? I'm also mentioning Dr. David Tay, who is the co-artistic director of the Thailand Biennale 2025, who couldn't be with us here today. I'm going to read out a message from him for all of us, which is incorporated in moderator Parmesh Shahani's questions today as well. Dear all, I'm sad to let you know I can't make it to Delhi for India Art Fair. I'd like to wish you a lively and penetrating conversation. Discussing the term global majority at an art fair, I'm reminded of Tin Maha's oft-quoted adage, in every first world there is a third world. Were we not given to putting these terms behind us, I might wonder quietly whether there isn't a first world in every third. I feel we should be as wary of logics that carve the world up as we are of platitudes purporting to unify it. Perhaps the art business needs such abstractions. I don't hear many artists wanting to identify with majorities these days, but I guess I'm wary of a category that's prone to turning feral or that remains more righteous than silent. Of course, majorities never actually govern. They help certain elites to govern, and that system that privileges them the most. Democracy is not exactly the rudest health. I don't come to curatorial projects with the diversity and inclusion agenda. I try to be pushing that envelope wherever and whenever I happen to be working, but the scope for it is contingent on the conditions of each gig. Right now, I'm trying to widen the image of the historical narrative bandwidth of a Sino-Thai tourism destination. In Istanbul, I was hoping to prise some of the local intelligentsia out of its Euronormative orientation. The excluded contingencies, the barriers to inclusion are specific to each place. Solution needs to be tactical rather than strategic. These reservations help to explain why in both curatorial and academic work, the term region has appealed to me more than anything global. In Southeast Asia, quite apart from naming a new market, region has been compelling as a frame for arts contemporaneity, quite conducive to both intellectual affinity and practical alliance artist to artist. What I'd hoped to discover from all of you is the extent to which that may be true of South Asia and why, and how the regions might compare as devices for curatorial work, for critical and transformative writing, and for the articulation of art histories beyond the narrative strictures of national modernity. I hope we'll have a chance for such an exchange in the future. We miss you, Dr. David, and I hand this over to Parmesh to carry this forward.
Thank you, Charlene, and thank you to the India Art Fair for the incredible hospitality and love that you've shown all of us, and thanks to all of you for being here on a morning where the Delhi election verdict is a strong contender to our panel on TV. But we're so happy that you've come here, and we promise that we'll be as entertaining, if not more, than the TV anchors. We will not shout over each other, but we will talk together with love and affection for each other. And thank you for the sign language interpretation and all the attempts at making the art fair more and more accessible each year. With lots and love and gratitude. To our wonderful panel, I want to take off from where David left. And to David, the idea of a global majority. And David seems to like this framework, this framing of a region as a more convenient way of examining the global majority. And I just want to ask each of you, whether it's the global south or this developing world, all of these are problematic in their own way. So I just want to ask each of you what this term global majority means to each of you, right? For some of you, it might mean decolonization. For the others, it might mean a way of making your work more accessible or inclusive. David said, he finds the term overall top-heavy and abstract, and region seems to be a better way. So Sharmini, maybe if we start with you and what the term means to you, and then Sangeeta, maybe you can tell us about how you think of this term, and also how you're imagining the Kathmandu Triennale through this lens as well. So Sharmini, if I can ask you to start.
Thank you. I'm going to preface this by saying it's a difficult one to answer. So there's some hesitancy in what I want to say, but I think hesitancy has really been at the root of a lot of the work we've been doing in establishing MMCA Sri Lanka, which is a museum of modern and contemporary art, the first of its kind in the country. So the first thing I think I want to mention is that with this term we're talking about global majority. It is an affirmative term in what it's setting out to do, seeking to move the disadvantaged position of the minority to the advantaged position of the majority, for example. And maybe just as a sidebar, it is important perhaps to contextualize where the term came from. It comes from, if I'm correct, a UK context, and the coining of the term is from a scholar, an educator, Rosemary Campbell-Stevens, and she was writing fairly recently, and her response for this term was in response to a government term, which was about defining minorities, BAME, Black minority, Black African minority ethnic. So I want to put that into, I think it's important to think of the context from which this comes from. That's just a sidebar I want to mention. Because the context from which I want to speak about is, in fact, in the term itself, the omission of minority is inferred, and it is omitted. And I think what is there for the work we're doing at MMCA is not to ignore this minority, and to think in the first instance about how to think, I guess, from a minority perspective. And in this respect, there's somebody that I would defer to who's written extensively about this, a Sri Lankan academic who passed away very suddenly in 2005, Kadri Ismail, who spoke or wrote a lot about this. His book, Abiding by Sri Lanka, is something that I would encourage people to read. In his book, in summary, he took aim at democracy, essentially, taking aim at a political system that, how could I describe it, structurally enables oppression by the majority. And he wrote about the resurgence of a new kind of majoritarianism in Sri Lanka. And I would say he was absolutely unsparing in his criticism of the Sri Lankan government. And he described this new kind of violence, and I want to just quote him saying, "This new majoritism searches incessantly for an internal enemy, the minorities, against whom it can sharpen its own identity," unquote. And he described this as a certain, he in his book, he describes it as a moral dimension. And the next point I want to make is thinking about, I guess, this moral dimension of the majority in terms of now the South Asia region, in recognizing the dominant geopolitical narratives that can join and certainly divide this region. Particularly as we sit here right now, we don't have colleagues from Pakistan able to sit here and talk about this term, for example. So the Indianization of the region is therefore perhaps this majoritarian reality that I want to bring into this panel discussion, and to ask, if we adopt this global majority position, are we also beholden to think about an elite minority within our midst? And to remember that this elite minority acts globally. The third and last point I want to make is, when we think about, and maybe this is speaking as more of a kind of empiricist, but the global majority speaks about 85% of the world. What about that 15%? So I'm setting up a museum, and it's that 15% of the world, of which there will be another percentage, who are formulating policies, who are driving, I suppose, ways in which museums today should act and operate. And, you know, I would want to ask, why is it that we are being dictated to by standards of practice in the museum sector, compliance and so on, by this 15%?
Thank you. And we'll get to that, why this 15% in a bit. But thank you so much for talking about, even within the even within the majority, that there is a dominance even within regions as well. And we can talk about that in a bit. Sangeeta, do you want to talk about what this term means to you? You've lived all over this region as well. So as Sharmini was saying as well, you've lived in Nepal, you've lived in Afghanistan, you've lived pretty much in every region in South Asia.
So first of all, I identify as a Nepali and as a South Asian, and very proud to be from this region. Nepal was never colonized, and it wasn't a part of the Commonwealth. So, you know, in 2009, I realized that people were talking about the global South, but it was always represented by countries in the region that had been colonized, and our voice was never heard. You know, Nepal, a Himalayan kingdom, exoticized, put in museums with traditional art, but no contemporary voices. And so we are part of the non-aligned movement, and you mentioned that Pakistan is not here today. I think we are globally positioned as a neutral territory for discourse and for exhibitions, for triennales, because we don't have a problem with our neighbors. So Pakistanis can come, Sri Lankans, Bhutanese, you know, anyone from the region. And the Triennale was conceived as a place maker for artistic discourse, no holds barred. As far as the global majority is concerned, you know, this was something that we started looking at perhaps in 2022 with our curators, Cosmin Constanas from Parasite Hong Kong, and our co-artistic directors, Hitman and Shilasa, who are keen on moving away from a more ableist sort of framework and including a decolonized lens, bringing into focus practices that had made traditional crafts invisible. How do we recognize our history? How do we unpack that learning? So this has been very central to what we are thinking of. And for 2026, I would like to acknowledge Natalie King, our curator for the next Kathmandu Triennale is here. Ashriya Lokandewala, who will be co-curating with us. We are going to talk about how we address these pluralities with Indigenous voices as well, with Dalit voices, making those who are invisible more visible.
Thank you. Thank you. Nancy and Simon, would you like to weigh in on this in the light of what Sharmini and Sangeeta said? And, both of you are independent curators, so perhaps you can curate without the institutional enforcement of the 15%, as Sharmini said, or guidelines, or, how does your independence as curators inform the choices you make, as well as the power structures that you have to negotiate with from these independent positions while trying to curate through the intersection lenses that you choose to curate from?
It's nice to be independent. But talking about global majority, it's like talking about a whisper. How should I be talking about global majority if I am majority? So to talk about global majority is already being conditioned by a history that is not mine. Why are people talking about global majority if not in comparison or in reaction to a global minority? So I like minorities. I like Europe. I try to help Europe, etc. Try to help them to structure their history, etc., etc. But when I'm outside of Europe, I am within the majority. And my main concern is precisely this. You have to tell your story outside of what they call history. This guy, at times I agree with him, at times I disagree with him. Hegel decided that, for instance, Africa was outside of history. And I invented an African philosopher who was saying that Europe was outside of history. Who decide what is history? Who's writing history? And I think this is what is important to me. And my curatorial practices, I try to avoid terms like global south, global majority, etc., etc. I've been traveling around the world, and what always strikes me is that people are talking about the region. So they're making themselves small. My region is the world. I'm here. I'm not interested in Southeast Asia. I'm interested in what is happening in places. And I think that if we want to, whatever, I hate that term, to decolonization, post-blah-blah-blah-blah, we need to deconstruct the terms of references and create new references. Because as long as we will be addressing a dead person is European history, we'll be fucked up. Because there's nothing to say, oh, they've been colonizing, they've been enslaving, they've been blah, 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 blah. All that we know. But what do we do? And this is what I'm interested in. How do I, because I'm a humanist, how do I teach the world about the world? And I mean, if I'm here, I'll have less work to do. If I'm in Germany, I'll have a lot of work to do. Because the very problem when we talk about colonizing, the point is that all the colonized countries know more about the colonizer than the colonized do. So they should teach a colonizer about things. So there's a kind of a complex, inferiority complex, that I hear whenever I hear global this, global that. It's as if people wanted to prove that they were existing. But to whom? Do I need to prove to my people that I exist? No. I mean, if I talk to my driver about the global majority, he will say, this guy is crazy. But I mean, I want to talk to my driver. I don't want to talk to Macron or to Merkel. I mean, Merkel was so powerful. I don't even know the name of the guy who's there now. And not certainly to Macron. And I think that if we want to do our job, we should stop thinking of the others, the 15%, and think about ourselves, not only in the words, in speeches, and in what we're doing. I mean, things are changing. And I think our role here is to acknowledge the changes. Our role here is to be the ones who are writing history and to get rid of whatever we were taught. Because for the generation to be, for the generation to come, it's important to say, here I stand. I don't care about the way they drive in Paris. I don't care about who they elect in the United States. If I'm talking about democracy, I want to talk about democracy here and now. And not to say, fuck Trump. Trump is not running this country. If I want to talk about contemporaneity, it's here and now. It's not in Venice. And this is the only way we can fill those empty pages. Because history is just about empty pages. Our job is to fill those empty pages. Because we're not busy writing. We're good people. We didn't think that you had to be superior to the other. And I mean, we've grown up. And we know that some people have been writing. And they say, we are. Okay. It won't work anymore because we are. And we are going to write too. And in the libraries, we won't have the text of this specialist about Southeast Asia, who was graduated in Cambridge, who was born in Oxford, whatever, telling us about India. We won't have this French super specialist telling us about Senegal. I mean, they're free to talk about whatever they want. I'm for democracy. But we are not free to talk about whatever we want. We have to talk about whatever we should.
Thank you. And Nancy, if you want to continue, I'll give you this mic, Nancy. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
We are the global majority. One microphone for 4 people, one microphone for one guy.
Thank you, Simon. I'd perhaps just take up one of the things that you spoke about, which is we have to know where we stand vis-a-vis these particular thematics of global majority, global south. And this is a question I asked myself when I started writing a few decades ago and curating as well. And the question related to my locus standi in this field has always been about how I can actually do art history, how I can remake art history, how can I read it against the grain. And therefore, I have actively created trans-regional art historical contexts rather than just, be a footnote to standard issue Western art history. So I think for me, it's always about action. It's about doing. And it's not about othering, as you were saying. And how does one approach this theme of global majority? All of our panelists have already, shared their opinions. So here goes the last one. In my own experience of working alongside vulnerable, marginalized groups as a cultural theorist and a curator, as well as a filmmaker in a previous avatar, I've realized that this term global majority is something that is not useful for me. It's in fact counterproductive. What is clear to me is that it's an abstract noun and it doesn't help me. One has to commit oneself instead to the labor of solidarity building, which brings these otherwise fragmented groups together with a recognition of a common predicament. In my exhibition of women artists at the CSMVS Museum in Bombay, called Woman Is as Woman Does, I exhibited the works of Dalit artists, Adivasi artists, and middle and upper middle class women artists side by side. And I also had showed the work of an Adivasi artist, Durga Bai Vyam, who has actually worked on the illustration of the biography of Ambedkar, to portray a kind of dynamic intersectional politics. And to situate these thoughts in a global art context, I would prefer to invoke Sarat Maharaj's term, entanglements, which eschews the binaries of majority, minority, West, non-West. The reason to invoke Sarat Maharaj is because even as the term global majority overturns the position of lack, of being at the receiving end of Euro-American domination, it still risks being trapped in this whole majority-minority binary. And it homogenizes difference. And that, I think, is actually very dangerous. Sarat Maharaj's term, on the other hand, is more capacious and expansive. And you can interpret it in various ways depending on what your vantage point or location is. For me, I interpret entanglements as a complex transcultural weaving of the histories of empire, revolution, mutual curiosity among societies, resistance, and nomadism. One such entangled history is that of the non-aligned movement. The newspaper photograph from my school days of Indira Gandhi greeting Yasser Arafat during the non-aligned movement. I think it was the 7th non-aligned movement, which was hosted by India. And for me, that photograph always brings back very, very important memories. Memories of not being aligned or not just being a satellite state to this or that bloc during the Cold War period. And it invokes notions of self-determination and autonomy. And again, I'm not just invoking the non-aligned movement because it is now, for the last, 10 or 15 years, people have been talking about the non-alignment as one of the starting points of decolonizing art history. This is something I grew up with. This is something that I, along with my friend Asila, we used to make these charts, where you had Nehru, Sukarno, Nasser, Tito, and Kwame and Nkrumah, and stick those pictures on the chart. I mean, of course, I know kids don't do that anymore, so now you know what but it's important for me because it's organic to my practice. I'm not just doing something because it's a trend that we need to decolonize our art history. In fact, for an essay for Art India, when I think it was celebrating its 10 or 20 years of being of practice, and I just talked about how even when it comes to the term decolonization, American academia has to tell us that you need to decolonize your art history, and then everybody in the art world, especially in our context here, starts talking about decolonization. But I'm sorry, decolonization begins with me when I was in my high school. So I just think that it's very important that when we use terms, they have to be integral to our growing up, our life, and our being and working. And that for me is extremely important. And the reason why I invoke the non-aligned movement is that even if it today is not relevant anymore, what's important is that it has always privileged the idea of the third way, or the third position. And that's what I take away from the non-aligned movement. the third position, because it means that there's a possibility that when two contributors engage in a dialogue, can we actually step outside of ourselves? And by stepping outside of ourselves, we are then able to release ourselves to something that is unforeseen, that is unpredictable, and that is unknowable. And that actually is what art is. Art is not a statistic or a tick box. So that's something that I'd like to share. Thank you.
Thank you. I really like the idea of entanglements as a framework for working through a lot, including my own work, which is not in the art world, but which is at the intersection of business, society, and so many other things. So we were talking earlier in the speakers' lounge about the negotiations, compromises, adjustments that we all have to do the work that we do. And I think using entanglements as a way of understanding that in so many of these we are involved, in some we are complicit, in some we are fighting each other, but we are entangled in these interesting ways is a useful way to think through some of the work that we do. We're now going to do a little show and tell with our work. So if I can ask each one of you to just take us through one example through your work of where you've gone through some of these entanglements and just unpack it for us. Simon, would you like to go first? And then maybe we can just go this way around. And if I can ask our folks to just bring up Simon's images on screen. Yeah.
No, Simon never uses images because images are tricky. I've always been a non-aligned within my family, within the school, etc., etc. So when we talk about non-alignment, I think those people had a great idea, but then we have to refuel it. For me, non-alignment is freedom. It's not just about the two blocks that have disappeared. It's about when I have to make a choice. At school, they say, you do this. I would say, I'm not going to align myself to this. I'll do that. Okay. I'll be punished or whatever. But this was not my problem. So I think we should rethink about the notion of non-alignment. And I think we should rethink the notion of region. Because I'm the only one representing something outside of your region. And we're talking about the global majority. I'm the minority in the global majority. So it is as if I was intruding in a family gathering. So it's nice to talk. It's better to do. I'll talk about something I did. It was called After Eden. And it was an exhibition about a collection of photography by Arthur Walter. And he called me and told me, I would like you to revisit my collection. And I told him, okay. And I guess when he called me, he didn't know me that well, because I had to kick him out of the kitchen where I was working, because he would come and say, this image is wonderful, don't you think? I said, I'm curating. You're just a collector. So that was the first thing. The second thing, he came to me and said, Simon, I don't believe in God. I said, good for you, but what's your problem? Well, you called the show After Eden. I said, yes, it's my show with your work. But what I liked about the collection is that Walter was a genius because he came too late. He's a German who made a lot of money in Wall Street, etc. And when he decided to collect photography, everybody had a German collection. Everybody had an American collection. Everybody had a collection. So he said, okay, I'm going to collect non-Western, whatever that means, photography. So it was not out of taste. It was out of necessity. A decent collector thinks he's a curator, a thinker, whatever. He wants to put his mark on the thing. So Walter was like, okay, I'm going to collect this. And I found that interesting to with images precisely, to write a story that will be common to all. So I had Chinese photographers, Indian photographers, African photographers, Latin Americans photographers, and they were all dealing with the same topic. And of course they were not. And this is something we have to be clear about here, that curators are liars and dictators. So I worked with the collection and I made the images say whatever I wanted them to say. I aligned them. I say I'm non-aligned, but as a curator, I aligned them according to a narrative that was linked to Eden, this notion of Eden. And I don't know if you like me, but when I was a kid, I received a telegram. There was no fax or email back then. And it was a very short message: God is dead, stop. So, since the guy is dead, we can deal with Eden. And this exhibition was starting with landscapes, plants, etc., moving through cities, and then finishing with the Anthropocene, another word I hate, the human, so progressively. And what I wanted to show within that exhibition was precisely not the regional thing, not the bababa thing. I was the puppeteer playing with history, and it was a history that was told by different voices, come from different places, and yet it was one history. And what I like about photography, contrary to visual art, even if photography belongs to visual art, but that's what I mean, is that it gives the illusion of reality. So people can recognize what they think they recognize. So I can say, this is a city, this is a building, this is a plant. And then they forget about who made the image. And then later on they say, oh, there's a Chinese. And the Chinese was just side by side with the African, side by side with the Latin American. Because this is what I'm interested in. Not in talking. I've been trained, philosophy, blah, 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 blah. And in showing. Because once again, when I curate a show, my main question is, what is my driver going to think about it? I don't think about the critic or my colleagues. It's about my driver. And if my driver can get a sense of what I'm trying to say, then I'm happy. Of course, the different levels of senses. But then when you curate, you have to take into account all the different layers. Of course, I'm telling a story. But what if my story is untranslatable? To whom am I talking? Why do I make an exhibition if I would make it for a handful of people who come to me and say, oh, Simon, I love when you're addressing Sartre, but I think that Deleuze would, and Panofsky. Who cares? I love it when somebody say, I cried when I saw this image. Wow. It's like when you were talking about images, you're talking about this guy who made a hold-up, Tito, on the non-alignment. Because we started in this region, as you say. And the guy jumped into it and became the king of the game. But when talking about images, if people see an image with Nehru, with Nkrumah, with Nasser, with Arafat, we can write tons of books. That image will produce something we're not able to produce with all our books. So what I'm interested in is to deal with, to quote James Baldwin, to deal with the evidence of things not seen. I think this is our job. At least this is I hope my colleagues agree with that. And when I was sitting in this strange place in Kassel, and when the German press started to attack my friend, Ranjit Osakot, saying he signed this paper, blah, 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 yeah, he's anti-Semite. Yeah? Ranjit came to me, because I was the spokesperson of this crazy thing. He came to me and said, Simon, I can't take it any longer. They're insulting me. They're being rude to me. I'm going to resign. I told him, no, stay. Let's have fun. But he couldn't take it any longer because they've been very hard on him. So he resigned. So I gathered my group and I told them Ranjit resigned because of the Germans, because of a politic that has nothing to do with what we're trying to do. And I gave them 2 solutions. Like in this song, should I stay or should I go? I told them, I'm leaving. You're free to stay. I said, Simon, are you crazy? If you leave, we're leaving. So we resigned from this finding committee of Castle Documenta. These are things we can do. No blah blah. We just do things. That's what I'm interested in. There's a Triennale, there's a Biennale, there's things. We just do things. When we're talking about global majority, let's stop talking about it. Let's show it. This is what I've been trying to do.
Sure. And I think no blah blah, we just do things. I want it on a t-shirt.
Excuse me, just one thing. If you say something, it may work. It may not work. I mean, you could have said something to Stalin and end up in the gulag. But I mentioned the microphone problem, and microphone appeared. Miracle.
Magic. Maybe we could have some of the slides up. While we're waiting, I shared a few slides, and it's actually perhaps this one. When I was speaking about the majoritarian reality that working in Sri Lanka frames. This is a cover from Hima that probably many of you are familiar with an upside-downness of thinking. The text for all the places, though, are the right way up. But there is an altering of who is in the north and who is in the south, with Sri Lanka here in the north. If you move to the next slide, this is going a little bit more, I suppose, in a more focused way towards Sri Lanka. This is an artist book project that I commissioned in my work with Raking Leaves. And you see the opening, it's a book by T. Shanathanan, and the cover has been opened. And here you can see a hand-drawn map. And I just want to read a beautiful description of the work that was written by the Sri Lankan writer Michael Ondaatje, who says, quote, "The book startlingly begins with an almost unrecognizable map of Sri Lanka until you realize it is upside down, with place names and towns printed the right way up. So Point Pedro and Kudakaman are naturally at eye level, while the southern part of the island, where the power and narrative voice usually reside, are now somewhere to the distant north. In fact, not even on the map. It is offstage. The furthest north or south we get is Vavonia," end quote. I think some of what I had said earlier in terms of maybe just thinking about these two images essentially is to think about how, in terms of a minority perspective, that these are histories. I might be speaking at odds here with my colleague, but they are histories that I think need to take stage. And I would feel really very uneasy about trying to forget about them. These histories of suppression, essentially from either the perspective of this artist, Tishanathanan, who's from the north of the country, or perhaps from the perspective of Sri Lanka within the region and other parts of the region, Nepal, Pakistan, who are seen as minoritarian countries within this geopolitical narrative of the Indianization of our region. I think these are the most important histories and voices. Maybe the history part is unavoidable, but these are the perspectives, which is, I guess, what I was saying earlier, the perspective of these voices, these countries that need to come in here and start thinking about how what we're speaking about when we're talking about global majority is for new kinds of understanding about the very problematic world orders that are circulating around us in all kinds of violent, systemic, interconnected ways. And I think those are definitely things that I hope these two works just help us to reflect a little bit on.
I'm waiting for my slide. So this is the Triennale 2026. So the first iteration of the Triennale was in 2009, and really it came about as a change in thinking because the monarchy was over. We had a new constitution, and in that constitution, it guaranteed a 33% representation of women in government, and that was a real move away from the patriarchy that existed. I mean, the patriarchy is still there. So this was a work by Govinda Azad, talking about the perils of being a woman in Nepal. Each edition of the Triennale is focused on pressing socio-political issues. And at that time, it was really important to talk about the status of women. The next slide, please. This was, in 2012, a work by Leon Sekong, which was installed at the zoo. It's about 400 feet long and made out of plastic, which was retrieved from the river in Cambodia. And, the Naga, which is there, is also, in our own culture, the keeper of the water body. And to see this image where the Naga is rendered, hopeless with all this plastic is a reminder of how we have to also respond to the environment, how we have to safeguard and protect it. And there were many other exhibitions around this period which focused on climate change. Nepal is at a highest climate risk nation, so it was very important to talk about climate change in 2012. The next slide, please. This is by a Chinese artist. This was, the Triennale was, the director was Philip van Kouteren from the Smack Museum in Ghent. This was by a Chinese artist, Song Dong. It's about how we're eating through the city. The city is where we are nurtured. The city is where all our creativity is centered. But each one of us eats away at it. This was a really beautiful work. Could I go to 2022? Yeah. This is a movie, a documentary by Pooja and Bibhushan. This is about migration. I mean, all over India, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, when you travel to Dubai or Malaysia, you see migrant laborers. You know, they've left because of climate change. They've left because there have been wars, civil wars. You had almost 30 years. We had 10 years of a very brutal and violent civil war. So this is about how villages have been left empty. And this is by Subhash Thebe, who's talking about ethnofuturism. So all these, ideas, concepts are there. I would also like to mention that Nepal is one of the first nations in South Asia which recognize the third gender. So there have been works also by third gender artists in this show.
Thank you, Sangeeta. So as I was saying, we should not reduce diversity to a matter of statistics, tick boxes, and self-congratulation. Rather, we must remain attentive to the complicated balance between the policy and critical ethnography that underwrites the diversity discourse and the unpredictable paths that such artists take in defiance of the primordial identity or legacy that is imposed upon them. And I'd like to elaborate this argument further later on in our discussion, because it's a very important point, especially in terms of my own practice. But since you have requested us to just show a few images from some of our exhibitions, my first, can we just go to the first slide, please? The very first one. The Zoom exhibition. The very first one, I'd given it in order. We don't have that. Okay, maybe then. Okay, maybe the slide will come up, but I can't see it right now. So, but anyways, I'd just like to talk about how my very first curated exhibition, Zoom Art in Contemporary India, was held at the Kulturgest Museum in Lisbon in 2004. And it could have just been easily a kind of glorified, country report, which was the flavor of the day at that time in the early 2000s. Instead, I chose to perforate the spectacular format of the survey art exhibition by including artist positions from marginalized locations. So I showed the work of the documentary photographer Sudarak Olwe in Zoom. And there was hardly any conversation at that time in the art world in the early 2000s about artists of Dalit or formerly untouchable background. However, I did not include him only to represent an under or rather non-represented position in the Indian art world. By choosing to show his photographic project, Refugee School Malmö, Sweden, it was a project of close-ups of children who had been rescued from the war or warlike conditions. And I wanted to demonstrate Sudarak's confidence in exploring the intersection between his own vulnerable social location and the precarity of the orphans. So here was a distinct form of worlding, phrased from within the crises of the global south, an attempt to relay a solidarity that had yet to be named. I also showed the works of Shantibai, and an artist from Bastar, who was one of the collaborators along with Navjot and Rajkumar and others. This collaborative project in the late 1990s then gave birth to the Dialogue Center, which was again like a third place, which was neither a place that was sponsored by the government or by the non-governmental organization. It was an artist space where municipal officials, teachers, artists, activists could come together and have a dialogue, but at the same time, there were studio spaces for the artists to continue with their individual practice. Now, since this is the slide that we do have here on the screen, I curated the retrospective of the senior artist Sudhir Patwardhan, and he's known for his, for his representation of urban culture, the laboring body, and this was at the National Gallery of Modern Art in 2019, and I called the retrospective "Walking Through Soul City," Ek Sair Rooh ke Sheher Mein. And since the show was not held in an Anglophone art gallery context, but in a public institution, it was important that we translate my curatorial essay into Marathi. Now, the art historian Nupur Desai was, of course, equal to the task of doing this translation. And it soon turned into a family affair. Nupur's parents, who are Marxist activists and share an affinity with Sudhir's leftist politics, also stepped in to guide the translatorial effort. So the act of translation becomes a political act, especially in the art world, where monolinguality excludes large numbers of people. On the opening night, I stood behind the counter and sold copies of the Marathi booklet since our intern could not deal with the demand. And the next slide, please. The next slide. Now it was my turn to share the barakat or grace that I had received from Nupur and her parents. When I was working on the curatorial monograph for my Sudhir show, I realized that there was simply not enough literature in English that offered a granular understanding of the caste-class politics of the turbulent 1970s in Maharashtra. I could not have written my chapter on Sudhir's illustrations for the little magazine Magova or the leftist study circles he was involved in without translating from Marathi the accounts of activists who had witnessed the Shahada land liberation movement of the Adivasis or the protests of the Dalit Panthers, who in turn were inspired by the Black Panther movement. So during the COVID break, I began to translate from the original Marathi the memoirs of activists published in Sankalp, an anthology edited by the artist Sanjeev Khandekar. I've shared this story to emphasize the importance of putting in the intellectual and affective labor required to bring about the kinds of transformations that we desire and not just engage in virtue signaling. The themes of mutuality and reciprocity are very important for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. And we have about 9 minutes left. And I just really like how each of you, Simon, whether it's in your solidarity with Ranjit, Nancy, it's how you, through your curation, through your creation of third spaces, through the act of translation, and Sharmini and Sangeeta, through your curation as well, all in a sense are resisting and creating through your curatorial practice a different kind of alternative way of seeing and of being. And so perhaps if we could, as we end this conversation, talk more about these kinds of resistances, especially in a world where state-sponsored funding is decreasing more and more. We are all, going back to your 15%, we are all in some way or the other dependent on larger corporations or perhaps more conservative funders for the kind of work that we do. How do we then continue to resist? How do we prevent ourselves from being gatekeepers? How do we prevent ourselves from, in a sense, through a curatorial practice, being those colonizing voices ourselves as we are trying to, do the work that we are doing and amplifying, the voices that we care about. So this is open to all of you. It's about how do we continue to resist in the face of being very conscious that we are at the India Art Fair as well. We are in a space which is corporate funded and so on. Is it even possible in these spaces to resist further than we are already doing? Simon, do you want to maybe attempt at...
I love the way you do it. Simon, maybe you want to, so it means Simon, you have to. No, I think basically that there was, back to the days, you're all too young to know this, when there was this discussion about center and periphery. And I got very soon bored about the conversation. because I had to explain to my friend that the center is where we are, and the periphery is around the place where we are. So there's no given center. I mean, to deal with art is always a matter of negotiation. It's a matter of playing chess. I'll give an example. I did a show at Beaubourg once, and Total, I don't know the new name now, wanted to put some money there, but the condition was that I would come and have lunch with them. So I came and had lunch with them, and they wrote this nice big check. The day before the opening, an artist who was at the entrance came to me and said, Simon, you know, the writing I had on my work, I want to change it. I said, okay, do it. I said, you don't mind? I said, no. So what was written normally in the work was that now that my father have lost his teeth, I can bite him. So he changed it into Totalement Africa, which means total lies African. So I said, great. So the director of the museum came to me and said, Simon, this is not possible. I said, well, this is an artist, this is a contemporary artist, what can I say? And when we opened the show, some president from a very oily country came, the president of Total, etc., etc. They came, and then the protocol just made sure his first work will not be shown, will not be seen. So we don't have to be that radical, but we know that we don't have money. They have money. I wrote a text once when I was a kid that was called "The Curator as a Naked King." He doesn't paint, doesn't have money, doesn't have an institution. That was the time where the curator was put there. I said, oh, come on. But we have to negotiate all the time with corporates, but not only with governments, because governments has their agendas. So it's a negotiation all the time. And it's also the way of, I remember an image I've shown in a very Muslim country, and when we opened the show, the minister didn't see it was in the image. It was a painting by Khada Amer from Egypt. It was beautiful, blah, 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 but under the knitting, etc., it was orgiac, sex, heavy sex. He came and said, oh, those ladies are doing such a ladylike thing. So basically, we are uncovered agents. We've always been, and will always be. I mean, we're sending hidden messages. We're sending messages on the bottle. And we'll always have to negotiate, no matter the power to be it political, being finance. We have to negotiate. And I think we know how to do it. We've always been doing it.
Thank you. Well, we have 2 minutes, so would anyone who I know.
Should I? Please. No. We can take a minute each.
I think 1 minute will go like this.
Yeah, for the first time, we have the government on board for the Kathmandu Triennale. Yeah, it is a blessing because they can take the messages to the remote parts of Nepal that we don't have access to. But we also have to be mindful of the fact that there can be control. So there is something that we will leverage as we move along. And I always like to see the glass half full than half empty. Thank you.
And I'd just like to add that I think it's very important to reclaim our public institutions because Sharmini and I we were having this discussion earlier that doesn't matter which political party is in power. It's important that we curate in our public institutions versus only curating in the Anglophone art gallery context, because the kinds of audiences you'll get at the CSMVS Museum or the National Gallery of Modern Art are not the same as those for a commercial gallery. And importantly, the citizens of India feel a sense of ownership to these institutions. They know that they can walk into these institutions the way they cannot walk into an art gallery which has a surveillance camera, which is not even at the street level in the first place. And therefore, I believe very strongly that we should not give up on these institutions, although, of course, the political situation may be fraught and risky. When I did my retrospective on Navjot Altaf, which was called The Earth's Heart Torn Out at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Bombay, we made a decision to show her work, which was in response to the Gujarat pogrom in the early 2000s. And this was in a public space, and we were, of course, quite scared, but we decided to go ahead and do it. And we had a video with the activist Tista Setalwad and with Rupa Modi, who had lost a son during the Gujarat pogrom, in conversation with Navjot. So I think that it's very important to constantly, to pick up the courage and to act in ways which are more democratic, more progressive, and fight against the right-wing reactionary forces. And I know that it's tough, and it's getting even tougher today, but it's something that we must do.
Can I just add one last comment? Because I think one of the things you also raised with the conversation was hope. And I don't really subscribe very much to hope, but I wanted to just mention, I think it's Martin Luther King who said something like, we should never give up on, there's infinite hope, but we must accept the finite disappointment. And I think that disappointment is that work that we need to do. And I think where some of that work begins, at least from the MMCA side, is who this institution is training. Who is it creating towards running institutions like perhaps some of the ones we've been speaking about, but those in India as well. This is such a huge task of training a group of people who honestly cannot come from an elite, socially exclusive, English-speaking class anymore.
Thank you all.
One question from the audience. We do
Sure.
have time.
Incredible.
There is already one question. Okay.
Hello, I'll be quick. So yesterday I had the opportunity to attend the Global Majority art tour that is happening around the fair, and there was a very interesting piece about architecture. So I do think that architecture, like Dr. Simon mentioned, accessible art is very important, art that is available readily to the common man. I think architecture is one of the most easily visible artistic pieces. So in the context of global majority, urban development, and beautification projects, how can we mobilize architecture as a tool in context of the anti-colonial world, the post-colonial world? Once again, we have a tendency to glorify European architecture, to sort of, I also love Europe. So how can we mobilize architecture in our surroundings?
I don't think I can speak to that question in a fulsome way, but I can mention that I think just in reference to one of the slides that you might have seen there was a publication. We recently did an exhibition on a forgotten architect called Minette de Silva. And Minette was somebody who in 1948, when Sri Lanka got independence, so the year after India gained independence, she established her own architectural studio as a woman. And she was the first of two women in the world to do this, before that, other architects, women architects, had done this, but alongside their husbands. The other architect I'm talking about is the Italian, Brazilian architect Linda Bobardi. Now, Minette, in terms of some of what you're speaking about, was very attuned to thinking about how we look at. She talks about. She wrote about something called experiments in modern regional architecture, and that was an essay that she wrote in the 60s, where she was speaking about needing to build with what you have at hand. I mean, not going and bringing something from abroad. I mean, kinds of things that we're talking about today in terms of the environment and being carbon neutral. This was Minette in the 60s. Who was heeding her? Who was listening to her? All of her work has really gone unnoticed because another elite narrative has come into play in Sri Lanka, which has looked at another male architect over and above Minette de Silva. So what I was going to say really is that sometimes we do need to just look a bit deeper towards what might have already been there. It's not always ahead of us, but the audience for what might have been then wasn't there. And it might just be worth looking back as much as trying to look ahead as well.
I'll just quickly, thank you, Sharmini. I'll just very quickly flag two exhibitions which happened at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Bombay, State of Architecture and State of Housing. Maybe you'd like to look at the catalogues for these. They were co-curated by Rahul Mehrotra, Ranjit Hoskote, and Kevan Mehta. And these are two very important exhibitions if you want to study the history of architecture from the Nehruvian era, where there was state patronage available, to the era of globalization. And importantly, SOA also talked about the contribution of women architects, or why there aren't enough women architects, although there are the classes, the architecture classes are full of female students. But then what happens? You know, I mean, how is it that they then end up, not building buildings, but actually, working only in conservation or in interior design, for instance? Not that these are not important, but many of these questions were raised in these exhibitions. So perhaps it's something that you'd like to look at.
Thank you, Nancy. That was very, very informative.